Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on elections around the world.
The coronavirus has taken a heavy toll on our lives, our economies, our societies, but also on electoral processes around the world, with many elections being postponed in order to protect citizens' health.
But this involves a delicate balancing act between ensuring the democratic right to vote and a government's responsibility to protect public health. So what can we learn from experience? Stay with us.
It's difficult to organise and hold an election with the social distancing conditions imposed by most countries in order to contain the spread of the coronavirus.
We agree on that. This is why, since the start of the coronavirus crisis, many governments with elections on the horizon faced a difficult dilemma: to press on with their election calendar while putting in place measures to protect the health of citizens, or to postpone them in line with legal safeguards.
International human rights law allows for electoral processes to be altered during a situation of emergency as long as the restrictions are legal, necessary, proportional to the emergency and temporary.
But the choice is not an obvious one, as both options entail risks that need to be carefully considered. For example, holding elections in a country severely affected by the pandemic can have serious effects on the turnout. Postponing an election, on the other hand, can lead to a loss of democratic control over government representatives for a period of time.
And decision makers need to take a whole lot of legal, technical and sanitary parameters into account, as well as constitutional arrangements, to ensure that democratic institutions function as they would in normal circumstances and that people's rights and freedoms are upheld.
What's clear is that, no matter what the choice is, a broad consensus amongst political forces, both in government and in the opposition, is highly desirable to avoid accusations of parties instrumentalising the crisis to their own advantage, as has happened in some countries.
So what can we learn from countries that had scheduled elections in corona times? Stay with us.
Well, since the start of the pandemic, at least 70 countries and territories around the world decided to postpone their elections, while at least 56 chose to press on with their electoral calendars.
Among those that have held elections during the pandemic, South Korea clearly gets the medal for having organised a highly successful election while protecting the health of its citizens. At the opposite end, like countries such as Burundi, which blatantly ignored health risks and put its population and politicians in serious danger of contracting the virus, the country's president may have died of coronavirus himself.
Several countries were caught by the coronavirus crisis with interim governments or presidents, including Bolivia, Sri Lanka and North Macedonia, while in others, such as Mali and Guinea, elections had already been long delayed, even before the pandemic, which made it difficult from a constitutional perspective to keep on delaying them.
Parties in power during the coronavirus crisis have often been accused by their opposition of trying to reshape the calendar to their own advantage, either by lifting lockdowns too early so as to be able to hold elections, such as in Serbia, or by dragging out transitional situations to stay in power longer.
This is what happened in Bolivia, where the opposition accused the interim president of using the crisis to further her political ambitions.
In the case of Serbia, the government decided to hold parliamentary elections at the end of June, despite warnings by the opposition about medical risks. The result was a landslide victory for the governing party, but less than half of Serbian citizens went to vote.
In Ethiopia, the opposition accused the Prime Minister of using the pandemic to delay the elections and stay in power beyond his constitutional mandate.
Now the European Union is a major electoral observer, and the European Parliament is always strongly involved in all electoral observation missions, but in the past months these have been severely curtailed due to the travel bans following the pandemic and because of the health risks posed to observers. So without having its eyes on the ground, it's been a bit more difficult for the EU to assess the fairness of some elections.
Truth is, the coronavirus pandemic broke out at a point when democracy was under significant strain in many parts of the world, and it risks exacerbating trends towards authoritarianism.
In many countries around the world, fundamental rights that are crucial in electoral contexts, such as freedom of expression, media freedom, or freedom of assembly, have been curtailed on public health grounds.
Authoritarian regimes have rushed to take full advantage of these restrictions in order to silence dissenters and stop protests, as happened, for instance, in Algeria. So there is indeed a risk that the pandemic will undo hard-won democratic advances in some countries.
Let's turn our attention to Chile, for example. After mass protests and civil unrest, Chileans were finally going to have a chance to rewrite the country's Pinochet-era constitution, but the vote, scheduled for the 26th of April, was postponed until the 25th of October 2020 due to the coronavirus. But the authorities still have to lay out the necessary arrangements to enable everyone to vote safely, including those most vulnerable.
A series of elections are planned in fragile states towards the end of this year and the beginning of the next, including the first popular general elections in Somalia in 50 years, presidential and parliamentary elections in Burkina Faso, and presidential elections in Afghanistan. But it is difficult to predict how the coronavirus may affect them.
What's clear is that this crisis provides a unique opportunity for electoral reform. Extending opportunities for early and remote voting by post or internet has been seen as a way to reduce health risks. However, we have to be very careful here, especially as regards remote online voting, which involves either limitations of the right to voting secrecy or serious cybersecurity risks that remain unmanageable to date.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast.